you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's a real honor for me to be here this morning and share in this very distinguished gathering. So to ladies and gentlemen in civil service, and those of you in the armed forces and all of the branches of government, and those of you who worked hard to prepare for this event, my particular thanks and gratitude to you as you serve your Lord and your country. Somebody asked me at the table before I stood up to speak here, are you nervous? And my answer actually is very simple. The day I stop becoming nervous before I speak, I will quit speaking. Because you always need to realize the cause that you represent is much greater than you are, and you don't often do justice to it. So I stand before you feeling totally inequipped and ill-equipped, but grateful to God for the honor He gives to me. When I was a younger man, my dad always thought I would end up in jail. And now when he sees people from the Judiciary that are at meetings that I speak at, if he weren't in heaven, he would have to be carried out, because they'd have probably thought they'd finally caught up with me. That's the way my younger life portended a future. But I want to thank you for having me here, those of you who had a share in inviting me. And Bruce, thanks for those kind words. Bruce Mattson and I, our friendship goes back over many years. We've had the privilege of sharing meetings in India as well. One of my great heroes in journalism was a man by the name of Malcolm Muggeridge. I think he was probably the greatest British journalist of the 20th century. There's a toss-up oftentimes between Muggeridge and G.K. Chesterton. And the irony is that both of them were sort of latecomers to God and became more moral philosophers than they really were journalists. Muggeridge especially had a very winding path prior to his own conversion experience, but he had a way with words, and I don't know if anybody I have ever read could turn a phrase like Malcolm Muggeridge could. And in the 70s, he said this: "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct." It was in the year that he died in 1990, the latter part of the year, when he had committed to write the foreword to my first book, The Real Face of Atheism, that I spent half a day with Muggeridge. And he was kind of stooped over, and his face almost like a gargoyle peering over a wall. Deep-set eyes. He had lost a lot of hope in the future of mankind. He had spent time as a journalist in communist Russia, and with all that he'd seen happening there, he wondered when that would spread like an epidemic on the devaluation of human life and the exaltation of brute power and brute force. But not long before Muggeridge uttered these words were the words of our own Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he received the Nobel Prize in 1964. Listen to just one paragraph from his speech. "I accept this award today with an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life that surrounds him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound in the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. Powerful words. Which way? Was Muggeridge's pessimism more realistic? Was Dr. King's optimism more realistic? Can unarmed truth and unconditional love really and finally have the day? I'm going to take a journey of thought with you, and I'll stay within my time, but I'm going to probably surprise you with the approach I'm going to take on this whole theme of peace and reconciliation. May I give you a couple of personal anecdotes, because that'll provide a backdrop, and then one that was not personal, but from a distant land, that'll put this thing in backdrop and perspective as to why I am heading in this route. In 1977, when things were pretty tough, and in the Middle East, as actually they are still now, my youngest daughter, Sarah, was just between 2 and 3, and my wife, Margie, and I just begun my first international trip, covering about 15 countries over 48 straight weeks back to back. I've often said when I came back, I looked like my passport picture after that trip. But here we were crossing over from Jordan into Israel, and at that time we went over the Allenby Bridge. And I'm sure many of you have done that crossover where the taxi brings you to this edge of the bridge, and the porter will take your bags to the halfway point, turn around and come back. The Israeli porter comes to the halfway point, takes your bridge, and takes you over into their part of the territory for you to stand in front of the authorities, answer a lot of questions, stand in line for a long hour, feel terribly worn out in the process, and then get your taxi through Jordan, through Jericho, and to Jerusalem. Sarah, as I said, between 2 and 3, was getting a bit restless as we were holding her in the arms at the end of the line. And at one point, looking at all these soldiers surrounding the people there, armed to the teeth, I had not known that she'd locked eyes with one of the Israeli soldiers. And then this squeaky little voice of hers broke the silence in the room, and she said, "Excuse me, sir, do you have any bubble gum?" People looked in her direction. Those who understood reacted the way you did. An Israeli soldier walked up towards us, and he looked at her with her olive complexion. And he called a mate of his, handed over his weapons to his mate, and put his arms out to Sarah and held her for a moment. And he said, "I'd like to take her to the back room for a moment, if you don't mind." And he took her to the back room, came back a couple minutes later, clutching her in one arm and a tray with 3 glasses of lemonade in the other, one for Sarah, one for my wife, one for myself. He said, "Come on over to the front of the line with me." He checked us through, put us in his Jeep, drove us to the taxi stand, and bid us goodbye. She earned her whole keep for the year with that one question. What was it that caused a child to momentarily disarm a man? So that nothing for the moment held him back to remember why he was actually there, and take that machine gun of his, put it aside, and reach out for a little child. I'm now a grandfather, and I watch the little ones with a different set of eyes. A corporal once said to Winston Churchill, "Sir, have I ever told you about my grandchildren?" Churchill said, "No, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it." Since I am not Churchill, I will tell you a story of my grandson. Little Jude was about just 4 years old now. And somewhere when he was about 3 and a half, my daughter, his mother, Naomi, she's a real fast mover. There's just 2 speeds for Naomi. She's either moving at high speed or sound asleep. She doesn't know middle of that. So she had lost her car keys in the house, and running around the house, didn't know where they were. She paused, slapped her forehead, and said, "I must be losing my mind." Jude walked up to her, I kid you not, and he looked into her eye and he said, "Mommy, whatever you do, please don't ever lose your heart, because I'm in there." All right? You've got a disarmed soldier. You've got a vulnerable heart of a mother. Out of the mouths of babes, he has ordained praise. And then this anecdote before I get into my lessons for the day here. I was crossing over from one Middle Eastern country to another. I won't name which these two countries were. My wife was with me, and in the border city, we were taken one morning just to look at this huge historic city. And a man was with his little boy, 10-year-old boy. And we were told this. He said, every morning I bring my son here to look over the hill to the other country. Every morning I've done it with him. And I remind him that his entire mission in life is to kill as many people on the other side as he can. Whither are we headed? Which way into the future? Unarmed truth and unconditional love, or keeling over as a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becoming extinct? The Bible in the book of Genesis in 25 tells us the story of Isaac and Rebekah as they were praying to be blessed with children. And this is fascinating what God says when she becomes pregnant. 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples from within you will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. May I dare suggest to you something here? God, who lives in the eternal now, did not say 2 products of conception are in your womb. He didn't even say 2 babies are in your womb. He said 2 nations are in your womb. Think about that. Locked up into the life of a young child, God saw the future of nationhood. These were not merely individuals, they were more than that. They were actually talked about for the future. And now may I suggest to you, 3,000 years later, the battle that took place in this household still goes on today in many ways from that very family. Part of the struggle we face in this world today is this disparity. In the West, we have very little respect for history. History dies from the previous day. We've forgotten yesterday's news. But in the Middle East, history never dies. They tend to want to avenge and exact a pound of flesh, generation after generation after generation. So in one extreme where history never dies, and in the other extreme where we've forgotten history, we had better start focusing on what will take us into the future, because the ultimate test of any civilization lies in what we do with our children. The ultimate test in any civilization is what we do with our children. So here it is. Rebekah is told that 2 nations were in her womb. The older was going to serve the younger. And she thought she would accelerate the march of destiny and started to move the younger in the direction that she wanted him to move, thinking she would sort of take over God's role and play God's role. 3 mistakes were made in this household. And if we make the same mistakes, then the future is very grim. If we learn from these mistakes, we can turn the tide and make for a better future. The first is this: the rejection of one in the very household by one parent in favor given to another. Do you know, we are called individuals. From the Latin, it really means we are indivisible. We come as a composite. We are whole units. And early in life, when we face rejection, when we face some sense of the superiority of another one over us, it is very difficult for a child to handle this. This is precisely what happened in the household. The father favored one, the mother favored the other, and the 2 boys were at loggerheads for most of their lives. My favorite essayist, the Englishman F.W. Borum, in one of his essays writes this: "Great was the wisdom of Solomon when he demonstrated one day more vividly and dramatically than it had ever been demonstrated before the utter unreliability of mathematics on the higher planes of human experience. There is a sense, I suppose, in which twice one are two, a sense in which 2 and 2 are 4, a sense in which many other propositions of this kind are partly, if not wholly, true. It is difficult to see how merchants and accountants and other excellent and well-meaning people can go back to their desks and counting houses if their faith in these arithmetical conclusions was seriously shaken. I hasten to say, therefore, that there is a plane of ledgers and cash books on which these propositions are approximately sound. But if you rise from that plane to a loftier one, you will find at once that they are simply untenable. They will not work. Solomon proves it at the city gate. It may be true that half a sovereign and half a sovereign makes one sovereign. It is obviously untrue that half a baby and half a baby makes a baby. Let the sword do its deadly work. Let it cleave this baby into two parts, and half a baby plus half a baby will represent but the grim and gruesome mockery of a child. Two halves of a baby make no baby at all. On this higher plane of human sentiment and experience, the laws of mathematics collapse completely. When, for example, a man distributes his wealth among his children, he gives to each a part. But when a woman distributes her love among her children, she gives it all to each of them. I do not believe that any man who has once fallen in love will ever be persuaded that 1 and 1 are only 2. He looks at her and he feels that 1 plus 1 would be 1,000,000. I do not believe that any happy couple, into the sweet shelter of whose home a little child has come, will ever be convinced that 2 and 1 are only 3. Life has been enriched 1,000-fold by the addition of that one little life to theirs. And I am absolutely certain that no pair from whose clinging and protecting arms their treasure has been snatched will find comfort in the assurance that 1 from 3 leaves 2. In the great crises of life, one's faith in figures breaks down hopelessly. Yes, there is a place of ledgers, but you deal with a little life, and you carve that child up emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. You've got but the grim and gruesome mockery of a child. I was speaking in one country last fall. They have their Father's Day, I think, in a Sunday in the month of August. And I was speaking to civic leaders, and 2 on to my right was the police chief. He was all decked in his uniform and all of his awards, and he leaned over and he said, "Ravi, let me tell you something." He said, "I have 18,000 law enforcement officers working under me." He said, "A few miles from where you and I are sitting is a place where Father's Day is the saddest day of the year, because 90% of those young men and women in that part of this city do not know who their father is." 18,000 law enforcement people working under him. This is a foreign land I'm talking about. And he says 90% of one community there does not know who their father really is. Those boys and girls are being carved up very early, ladies and gentlemen, and the future will be grim for them when they have not observed a household where truth and love has been poured into their lives. We are living in such precarious times where our children are longing for answers in truth. And as Winston Churchill said, it's the most valuable thing in the world, oftentimes protected by a bodyguard of lies. Truth is so valuable. Love is the motive and the empowerment of a life to bridge gaps where there is a brokenness and where there is a hardness between people. In this home, the 2 boys were raised, carved up. Father liked one, mother liked the other. Implicit in the acceptance by one of the other was the rejection of the other for the one. Not only did they learn through favoritism, they also learned with a breakdown of communication. There was really no communication in that household, because it tells us when Esau got married years later, he said, "I had no idea I'd offended and hurt my parents so much in the choices I'd made, and the choice I'd particularly made." This is a fascinating thought, because in the East and in the Middle East, we communicate so much with our kids and build the values from generation after another. I ask you to think with me for a moment. When the children come home today from school, who are they listening to? Who is instructing them? Are they down in the basement with some nameless person polluting their minds and bringing all kinds of ideas and planting it into their consciences? It's a lonely world for our young people. I spoke to 40,000 university students 2 Sundays ago at what is called the Passion Conference. Some of you watched that. The number one and number two things they wrote down in the questionnaire that was troubling most of them, the curse of pornography and the toll it takes on the lives of young men and their homes, and the urge to commit suicide. Imagine 18 to 24-year-olds facing these two deep struggles: how to deal with pornography that invades their consciences, and how to deal with the urge to take your own life. I speak on campuses for most of my talks. I don't know when I have been to university campus last, but that the crowds were packing them out with students, overflow crowds, and when I listened to them afterwards talking one by one by one, that loneliness within is huge. They are looking for somebody to really talk to them, somebody who'd give them the values not only of what and of why. We in the West are living dangerously because we are living in a cut-flower civilization. We think we can tend the petals after we have uprooted that on which our values were ultimately built. You see, our laws are the roots. The trunk is the political structure. The branches is culture. The laws are the roots. The trunk is the political structure, and the branches are our culture. What is going to hold the roots? If we don't have a moral soil to hold the roots, ultimately, it'll all fall apart, and it will come apart. Alexander Solzhenitsyn says there's an irreconcilable difference between good and evil, and you cross those at your own peril. This is a reality. Moral reasoning is no longer popular in our educational institutions, and if moral reasoning has died, the roots will then rot, the trunk will collapse, and it'll be shown in the branches and the extremities of our homes. The moral soil is an imperative for you and for me. Solzhenitsyn went on to say this: when I was a little boy, I used to play around the house, and late at night in candlelight, I would hear my grandfather in whispering tones talk to my parents and to the rest, and I always knew the evening was coming to an end when my grandfather would be getting up, and then he would say, "Do you know why all this is happening to us? Do you know why all this is happening to us?" He'd say, "It's because we have forgotten God." And Solzhenitsyn said, now after reading thousands of pages and writing tens of thousands of pages, if you ask me what's happening in the West, I will say they have forgotten God. All of our speeches can be flowery. All of our eloquence can lead us into all kinds of imagination. But if the roots are not held by a moral soil, which comes from a transcendent purpose given to you and me, the trunk will not be able to stand, and the branches will ultimately collapse as it brings it all down. You and I, and especially to those of you in high office in the legislative branch, may I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, what an honor it is that you even give somebody like me a hearing. But I want to say to you, you carry a weighty responsibility into the future, a huge responsibility. We're counting on you to make wise decisions for our homes, for our children, for our families. That's the future, and it's going to be either Muggeridge's prognostication or what it was that Martin Luther King talked about, unarmed truth and unconditional love. Thirdly and quickly, they learned through deception. They taught their boys how to win through deception. I don't have time to deal with this. There are worldviews today that thrive on deception, that are rooted in deception, where deception actually is a virtue. We are living with that around us. And so there's the mangling through favoritism, breakdown of communication, and learning through deception. Things happen. Jacob is on the run. He's separated from his family. Duplicitously, he's lied to his father, pretended to be Esau, stole the blessing, and he's on the run. And while he's on the run, he lies down and puts his head on a stone for a pillow. And God speaks to him in a dream. And as God speaks to him in a dream, he wakes up saying, I never knew God was in this place. You see, he thought he was running away from all of reality. God, like the hound of heaven, was following him. As Francis Thompson says, I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my mind. And in the midst of tears, I hid from him under running laughter, adown titanic glooms of chasmed fears. Up vistayed hopes I spared from those strong feet that followed after. And he ends the poem by saying, poorest, blindest, meekest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest love from thee that dravest me. He was driven away from his family, and God speaks to him in a dream. Francis Thompson read this passage and wrote one of the most magnificent pieces of poetry ever. Thompson was a drug addict. 3 times applied to Oxford, was turned down even though he was a genius. He had lived in 2 places having left home, Charing Cross, where he bought his drugs, at night wrapped his dirty raincoat around him and slept by the River Thames. And after reading this passage, his life was so moved. Charing Cross with drugs, Thames to try and get a night's sleep. And he wrote this called The Kingdom of God. O world invisible, we view thee. O world intangible, we touch thee. O world unknowable, we know thee. Inapprehensible, we clutch thee. Does a fish soar to find the ocean, an eagle plunge to find the air? Do we ask of the stars in motion if they have rumor of thee there? Not whether wheeling systems darken or our benumbed conceiving soars. The drift of pinions would we hearken, beats on our own clay-shuttered doors. The angels keep their ancient places, touch but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis your estranged faces that amiss the many splendored thing. But when so sad thou canst not sadder, crying upon thy so sore loss, shall shine the traffic of Jacob's ladder between heaven and Charing Cross. Yea, in the night, my soul, my daughter, cry clutching heaven by the hems, lo, Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret, but Thames. But when so sad thou canst not sadder, crying upon thy so sore loss, shall shine the traffic of Jacob's ladder between heaven and Charing Cross. Yea, in the night, my soul, my daughter, cry clutching heaven by the hems, lo, Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret, but Thames. You can't outrun God. He'll meet you where you are. He'll meet you where you are. One of my great privileges to speak to our troops all over the world. I was only a youngster in my 20s when I was speaking in Vietnam. My life was changed, praying with hundreds, if not thousands, of our militia that were there, one by one with 10, one with 15, one with 20. As in the loneliness of war, they wanted to hear a voice from God's word and wanted to pray with somebody. The first part of a turnaround is communion with God. Second part of the turnaround is reunion with his brother. On his way back, years have gone by, and he's going to meet up with Esau, and he's terrified, and in typical Eastern fashion, he's sending a lot of gifts ahead of time. Soften my brother up, he's a big man. Let me soften him up. In India, we call it mej ke niche, which means under the table. Deal with it under the table. Send another gift, send another gift. And now he comes and meets up with Esau. Esau could have made mincemeat out of him. Esau didn't. But you know what had to happen first? Jacob wrestled with God in prayer and said, I want your blessing. And God said to him, what is your name? Why? Because when he stole the blessing, he pretended to be somebody he was not. His father was blind. Now he's looking at an all-seeing God. God says, "What's your name?" He says, "You got me. I'm Jacob." God says, "You know what? Because you've admitted who you are, I will make a great nation out of you." We will never be a great nation until we admit what our hearts are really like before God. It's key. And so he meets up with Esau, and he's forgiven. And you know what he says to Esau? "I see on your face the face of God. I see in your face the face of God." Do you realize the Judeo-Christian faith is the only worldview that describes you with the credential of Imago Dei, the image of God? You know, this man comes to Jesus and asks him a question because he's trying to get him politically stirred up. But first he tries to get him legally stirred up. One of them at least does. Says, which is the greatest commandment? See, Moses gave 613. David reduced them to 15. Isaiah to 11. Micah to 3. To do justice, love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. So he looks at Jesus and says, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus didn't give him one. He gave him two. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all of the laws and all of the prophets. You see, because of the first, the second naturally follows. Without the first, the second is with its feet firmly planted in midair. To love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. So he couldn't trip him up religiously, so they tried to trip him up politically. Is it all right to give taxes to Caesar? That's one question I wish Jesus had answered differently. Then it would have been so wonderful to be both rebellious and sanctified at the same time. So you're going to get my taxes? Absolutely not. So Jesus looked at him and said, give me a coin. Whose image is on there? The man says, Caesar. Jesus said, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which belongs to God. The fellow was stumped, but he should have had a comeback question. Comeback question should have been, what belongs to God? And Jesus would have said, whose image is on you? Caesar's image is on the coin. Yes, pay your taxes, please do. But whose image is on you? You belong to God. And so we see it, communion with God, reunion with his brother, and then he does the last thing. He gathers them all together as his boys and children and transfers the trust to the next generation. You know the famous watch Patek Philippe? I walk through the streets of Singapore, I see their posters everywhere. You never really own a Patek Philippe. You only are protecting it for the next generation. I've got news for them. It's not just the watch that you don't own. There's very little you actually own. You're always protecting it for the next generation. Especially truth transferred with love. I'd like to close with two quick illustrations back to back. May I? Please give me your undivided attention. Started with two, and end with these two. Speaking at the UN prayer breakfast years ago, they asked me to speak on the search for absolutes in an age of relativism. And that's a tough subject, especially at the early hours of the morning and when you are not supposed to offend anybody. So I said, can I talk to you about the four areas in which you look for absolutes? Evil, because you like to call some nations evil. Justice, you're supposed to be looking for just societies. Love, when you leave your families, you miss them. Forgiveness, when you blow it, you want your colleagues to forgive you. Evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. They're all leaning forward, listening now. It's about an 18-minute talk. I say, can I ask you this question? Where in the world did these four converge at one time in history? was on a hill called Calvary, where evil in your heart and mine trampled underfoot the love of God. In his justice he paid with his Son and said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. You know what? The cross has the answer for this world, because it has the answer for you and for me. What we need more than anything else is not solutions outside, it's solutions in here. We need a Savior. And here it is. I was part of a peace mission with one of the former archbishops of Canterbury. I was just one of the 5 others that he took along with us. We were meeting with Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders. It was a tough week, really tough week. It was at the time when Yasser Arafat was alive and he wanted to meet with us and so on. Long story. But we were with one of the sheikhs who was one of the 4 founders of Hamas. Lost several of his children in his cause, muscle-bound individual, angry. The room was full of cigarette smoke, and he had his cohorts there. I think he'd served many years in prison, and he was really gesturing with a lot of anger. And then the Archbishop gave 5 of us a chance to ask one question each. My turn came. I won't tell you what the question was. It was a private meeting. I looked at him and I asked the question and he answered it, and I said, Sheikh, I don't like your answer. That's okay, I don't like it. I don't think your answer is going to get anywhere in the future in building bridges. I said, but let me tell you something, Sheikh. Not far from here is a hill. 5,000 years ago, a man by the name of Abraham took his son up that hill. Please, let's not debate which son, I said. Can we just agree he took his son up that hill? And as the axe is about to come down as his expression of faith in giving his son, God stopped that arm. The Sheikh said, yes. I said, well, God, what did God say? He didn't have the answer. God said, stop. I myself will provide. He said, right. I said, Sheikh, not far from where you and I are sitting is another hill. 2,000 years ago, God kept his commitment and sent his son, and this time the axe did not stop. I said, until you and I receive the son that God has provided, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for position, power, land, and prestige. I said, that's all I have to say to you. The Archbishop looked around and said, maybe it's time for us to go now. So we left. As I was about to go down the steps, the Archbishop put his hand on my shoulder and he said, Ravi, that was of God. I said, I sure hope so. The Archbishop was the guest of honor, so the Sheikh was ushering him into the car, but suddenly I heard the patter of feet behind me. I turned around, it was the Sheikh. He twirled me around. Big guy. I have 2 titanium rods in my back. I thought that was it. It's going to be a broken man. He looked at me, patted me on the face, kissed me on both sides of my face, said, Mr. Zacharias, you're a good man. I hope I see you again someday. In a few weeks, I will be there again someday. I do not know if I will be seeing him, but I tell you what, while the children of the world for the future is the key, and the message of the gospel is our only hope, where do we start? It's in your heart and mine. Your heart and mine. Thomas Merton said, man is not at peace with his fellow man because he's not at peace with himself. He's not at peace with himself because he's not at peace with God. God has provided an answer for you and me in his Son. Take that message and let's pray that unarmed truth and unconditional love will ultimately have the word in reality. Raise your sons and daughters with that conviction to make a better world for the future. Thank you for giving me a hearing.